I have prepared a couple of different versions of the smiley we modeled in the previous video, and in this video we're going to compare these different versions. In this render, all four versions pretty much seem to look the same, but as you will see, each of these versions is quite a bit different from the other versions. The second version from the left is the smiley that we did in the previous video, and I've made a version that has fewer polygons, which is over here on the left. I have made a version that has more polygons, and I've created a spline version of the smiley. First of all, I want to compare the polygon count of these four different objects. So I'm going to switch off the subdivision surface objects here, and let's maybe go to the perspective view here, and I'm going to select the low poly smiley that I did. And for this one I used only 5 rotation segments for the eyes and very few polygons for the mouth. I only have 6 polygons to define the mouth on this object. If I go to polygon mode, you can see this version has 149 polygons. The second version is the one that we did in the previous video, and this one has 208 polygons. And the third polygon version has 338 polygons. And for this one I used 8 rotation segments for the eyes. As for the mouth, I used exactly the same number of polygons that we used on our smiley in the previous video. So let's check the polygon count on the spline version. If I right click on the extrude object and go to object information, you can see that the polygons are 0 in the scene, but if we convert this object to polygons, it would have about 2,500 polygons. So that's the highest polygon count in this lineup here. Next we're going to have a look at the topology of these four objects. Switching back to the front view here, and I'm going to switch the display to growth shading lines so we can see the geometry. On our low poly version, the geometry is not particularly good, and I wouldn't really do this object like this, but for this version I really tried to use as few polygons as possible. The topology on the other two objects here is pretty good, and on the spline object you can't really see the edges, but the geometry usually is horrible. The spline version is the easiest version to do, because all we need really is 3 circle splines, and for the mouth I used 3 points. You can see them here, so pretty simple and fast to do. So now let's have a look at these objects when we render them close to the camera. And first of all I'm going to compare the low poly version with the version that we did in the previous video. I'm going to switch on the subdivision surface objects again, and let's go to the display menu here and select isoparms. Although the topology on this object here is not particularly good, the subdivision actually works pretty well. So let's do a render of these. And you can't really see the difference. Both of these look the same. But something has to be different because we have a very low poly object here. And the difference, of course, is the setting for the subdivision surface object. If I select the subdivision surface object of our first smiley, the low poly version, you can see I've cranked up the editor to 4 to make it look the same as the higher poly version. And for this one I only need a subdivision of 3 to make this look nice and smooth at this distance from the camera. If we compare the polygon count that's created by the subdivision surface object to make both of these objects look good, you will see that the polygon count will be very different. So on the low poly smiley we have to use a subdivision of 4, and you can see we have 149 polygons without subdivision, but with the subdivision object we have 38,000 polygons. Whereas on the higher poly version, where we don't need as many subdivisions, we only have 13,000 polygons. So let's compare the second version to the third version. And again, I'm going to do a render first. So you can see there's no difference really between these two objects. But again, the difference is the setting for the subdivision surface object. Now we have a subdivision of 3 for our smiley here, and for the highest poly version that I did, I could reduce the subdivision editor to only 2. And this higher poly version only has 5,700 polygons at render time. And now I'm going to compare the high poly version to the spline version. So again, if I render these, they will look the same in the viewport. For the spline object, I turned the angle of the spline down to 4. The more you decrease the angle, the more detail you will get for the spline and the smoother it will look. So let's see, this one was only 2,500 polygons. So which version is the best one? Well, the answer to that is there is no best version. It all depends on what you need. For example, the lowest poly version, which would create a lot of polygons if we do a close-up render. If this is not close to the camera, we can take the subdivision editor down to maybe 2 or even 1. 1 is not enough, but 2, and we would still get a nice and smooth looking object. And it doesn't look any different from the other ones, which are much more high poly. So at this distance from the camera, the low poly version might be the one you want to use. And for close-ups, you can use any one of the other objects here. If you want to do something very quickly, you could go for the spline version, because that's really easy to do. So you can see there's a lot more than just the one version we did in the previous video, and what you want to do really depends on what you need for your scene. The version you want to use also depends on what you want to do with the object. For example, do you want to deform the object? If you want to use deformers, you're probably better off with the polygon versions, because as long as you have good topology, the polygon versions will give you no trouble at all when you use subdivision surfaces. And the reason simply is, if I switch that display to road shading lines and if I go to wireframe mode, the reason simply is because we have such evenly distributed meshes, and these will really work well with deformers. So if I crank our low poly version back up to 4, I can show you how these objects will look when we deform them. And I've prepared a twist deformer that I've added to each of these 4 objects. So let's go ahead and switch that deformer on. And you can see the deformation on the polygon objects is pretty good. Now, of course, because the deformation is so extreme, the geometry will start intersecting at some point. But although we're getting stretched geometry, the objects will still look nice, and deforming them is not difficult at all. You just have to add the deformer and that's it. On the spline object, that is a little different. You can already see that something's wrong with the geometry here. So if I render this, it will not look very good. And of course you can try to get a good result by changing the settings for the extrude object and for the spline, but you'll have to play around quite a bit to get a good looking result. And the quality of the result will very much depend on the spline. So this smiley in a way is a bad example for using a deformer because it's a very simple shape. If you have a complex spline with tight curves and corners, you will almost always break the geometry. But let's have a look and see how we can fix that. So usually what you do is you go to the extrude object, and here on the caps tab we can turn this into a single object. You can already see some things change and it looks a little bit better. And then we can also switch the type from n-gons to quadrangles. And we can also select regular grid. I've already prepared the settings. And we can change the width. In this case, I have changed it from the default of 10 to 5 centimeters. So we're getting a pretty dense mesh, but the deformation already looks a lot better, but it's still very faceted on the outside. So what we could also do is select the spline, and we could change the intermediate points from adaptive to uniform, for example. And you have to crank the number up quite a bit to get a nice and smooth looking result. So in this case, this is working pretty well, but like I said, it's a simple spline. Deformations like these will give you a lot more headaches on more complex splines. And of course, on the polygon object, because the deformation is so extreme, we're getting faceted borders as well. And in order to fix that, we would have to select the subdivision surface object and increase the subdivisions. So this is looking much better now. And if I compare the polygon count, our high poly object now has 21,000 polygons. The spline object, on the other hand, has 58,000 polygons. So that's quite a difference. So the type of object you create will also depend on how you want to use the object. I'm going to switch off all of these twist deformers again. And the last thing I want to show you is two different versions of the low poly object. So now I'm going to switch off all of the other objects here, so we don't get distracted, and we'll focus on our low poly smiley here. I'm going to switch off the subdivision surface object, and let's do some beauty surgery on the mesh here. One thing I can't really change is the triangle on the eye here, but that's something that is not that important. If I subdivide this object, and let's just decrease the subdivision editor to 1, you can see that this triangle here, when subdivided, turns into a number of 4-sided polygons. And since this triangle is on a flat surface, we could get away with it. What I don't like is the geometry here at the center. So how can we change that? I'm going to move this smiley over a bit and then drag out a copy. So one thing we could do is we could continue this edge here further down here. However, we cannot continue this edge all the way to the border because we need to make sure the segments of the disk stay even in order to give us a circular shape. So we have to terminate these edges before they reach the border of our smiley. And there's 3 areas where we can terminate these edges. One would be down here, one would be the bottom of the mouth, and the other area would be up here. And if we change the geometry up here, we probably will not add too many new polygons. So let's go ahead and try that. So what we can do is maybe move this point down a bit, go to edge mode and select these edges here, and we can simply dissolve them. So now we have a big n-gon here. And in order to remove this n-gon, I'm going to select these edges here on the mouth, and then I'm going to use the slide tool. And for the slide tool, we have a very useful option, which is the clone option. We can either check the box in the attributes manager here, or if you want to do this in the viewport interactively, simply hold down the control key, left click and drag. So we're dragging or cloning these edges here. So let's do something like this. And now what we can do is go back to point mode, select these 2 points here and connect them. And then we could use the polygon pen tool to weld these points here. And you can see we're getting a couple of four-sided polygons. Now these ones right under the eye are not good topology. So what I'll do here is I'll select these 2 points and we can scale them. And maybe we could move them down a bit further. So by doing these couple of changes, we've created a much better looking topology. And if we subdivide this topology, it will look much nicer than the one on our other object here. And if we take a look at the polygon count, our improved version has 152 polygons. That's only 3 more than on our low poly object here. I've created one more version of this low poly smiley, and I'll just move these 2 over a bit. So I have this version here. And on this version, I didn't finish the edges up here, but I terminated the loop down here at the bottom of the mouth. So if I switch that off, you can see how that looks here. So I've continued these edges down to the mouth to create this loop here. And if we take a look at the polygon count, this one has 164. If you want to, you can download the project file and play around with all those different smileys. If you want to, you can create even more versions, because the ones we did are not the only ones you can do. So I hope you found this tutorial useful. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.